What's the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement?
It's basically a buyer broker agreement. It's the buyer representation agreement,
Mm,
meaning it's the agreement between a buyer's agent and their buyer. It's the
mm,
equivalent of a seller and a listing agent's agreement, the listing agreement, if you will. It's the
mm,
equivalent on the buy side. It's
mm.
establishing the relationship and the duties and the responsibilities of each party entering into that agreement where you have an agent who's going to represent you on the buy side and the buyer.
Like, why should a real estate agent that is closing the 2 to 9 deals a year, why should they care about this? Like, why is this important?
So the buyer broker agreement in most states right now is being overhauled dramatically. This is not a new document. This is not a new way to establish representation between an agent and a buyer. It's just not one that's used very often for the most part. And that's because of like the real estate norms leading into, today have been that the listing agent and the seller through negotiating the compensation to the listing broker also predetermine or pre-negotiate what they're going to offer to the buyer's brokerage as well. And
Mm,
and just so everyone's clear, the way that that plays out is, at least in California, right? Because I'm in California, that's where my specialty exists. But I think for most states, it's similar, where the listing brokerage and the seller determine the total commission that's going to go to the listing brokerage. And a portion of that total compensation is going to be offered to the buyer's broker. So, in
mm,
that dynamic, who's paying the buyer's broker? The listing broker.
mm.
Yes.
Makes
So,
sense.
that's kind of been the lay of the land in real estate for a long time. And that's why a lot of agents have not really concerned themselves with establishing that buyer broker agreement or how they're going to get compensated by representing a buyer, because the norms of real estate are that that's going to be paid for through the listing side, through the listing broker or from the seller, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
With a lot of the changes coming our way with all this litigation in the real estate space, we're going to have to do a couple of things um, to really make sure there's a lot of clarity for the consumer. And one of them is make sure that the seller's abundantly aware that they were never required to pay the buyer's broker. Okay, again, the listing
Mm,
broker paid the buyer's broker. But that also means for the seller, in case they weren't aware, you don't necessarily need to compensate your listing broker enough to turn around and compensate a buyer's broker. Okay. I
mm,
personally think there's a lot of hindrance there to the seller, but that's their decision to make. What do I mean by that? I think the reason that's been the norm for so long is because it's such a highly effective marketing strategy.
mm,
You're having your listing brokerage incentivize the other companies out there and the other brokers and agents to come and want to sell your home because there's compensation already established.
mm,
So in the marketing perspective, it has always been the most effective way to navigate. But
mm,
in light of the norms, people not for whatever reason being clear anymore on the consumer side that that's never been an obligation, they never had to do that. We need
mhm,
to be a lot more clear moving forward so that all consumers understand what is needed, an obligation, not an obligation, and all the ways in which they can negotiate. Okay.
mhm,
With that said, if sellers start to determine with their listing brokers that they are not going to pay a buyer's broker, then the buyer's broker and the buyer need to establish how they're going to represent that buyer, still make sure that that buyer has access to representation and what the compensation will be and how to determine how that agent gets paid. So there's a lot going
mhm,
on now.
mhm,
And again, it's all still the same, Cameron. Just know that it's how things have always been done. It's just that for whatever reason, the consumers feel like they perhaps lost sight of the fact that none of these things were required of them. So we have to be overly clear on what their options are. And that's where a lot of these agreements are coming into place to make sure that there is a very thorough discussion as
mhm,
well as documented, signed off on, paper trails to make sure that the consumer knows what their rights are or what their negotiation opportunities are.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, one thing that was really that stood out to me that you were talking about earlier is that differentiation between exclusive and non-exclusive. Could you
Yes.
like get into more detail on that? Like more,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So essentially, what happens in this buyer broker agreement, at least in California, and again, I think these changes are definitely coming to all states, but I know in California, not only do we have really big contracts anyway, because we tend to be just in general a litigious state, but for that reason, we tend to have a pretty extreme amount of disclosure, which, quite personally, I think in this case, I think is a really good thing. But
Hmm.
going back to your question about the buyer broker agreement, what it does is it allows for the brokerage and the buyer to establish the type of relationship they're going to have, be it an
Hmm.
exclusive relationship or a non exclusive relationship, meaning the buyer will be able to make a decision with their agent, which is going to be the benefit of the agent as well, to know
Hmm.
if they're going to have an exclusive relationship or if that buyer wants the freedom and intends to work with other agents. Okay. It's a good to know. What it also does is allows for the agent and the buyer to determine if there's been other broker involved properties or other representations with that buyer so that they can establish if they go and buy a specific property that maybe another brokerage was representing them on, well, then they're not going to owe a compensation to this new agent, that one only.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
So it really takes this framework of a lot of things were a little more taboo in the real estate space between a buyer's agent and a buyer. Have you worked with agents in the past? Did they show you other properties? Hey, agent, how exactly are you paid? And all of those things are brought into this document so
Hmm.
that we have not only a very thorough conversation, but again, a paper trail as to establishing what's already happened and how are we going to proceed moving forward. And of course, how that agent's going to be paid.
Hmm.
So there's a lot going on in this document.
Yeah, and you may have mentioned this, so forgive me if you have. In my eyes, I'm like, okay, this should be a norm. Like this is like, if I didn't know the real estate industry, I would assume after you just said that, I was like, oh, okay, like the process is when you meet a buyer at a home or however you come across this brand new buyer prospect, the next step is like, all right, cool, let's sign this and then let's get everything started.
Mhm.
Is that the norm in the industry?
I'm gonna say that it's not. In full
Yeah.
transparency, I've been in the real estate industry for 20 years. So when I was being taught real estate when I first started, I was not taught to sign a buyer broker agreement when I started working with new buyers. It was definitely more of adding value, a handshake, and making sure that through, the relationships that I built, that I would have loyalty with my buyer clients. Over the course of 20 years, I have a lot of processes, a lot of ways in which I really try to build that loyalty into how I work with my buyer clients. But a buyer broker agreement was not the norm. And I still think to this day, it's not necessarily the norm. Okay.
Mm,
But it makes perfect sense that it always should have been the norm. So, to
mhm,
speak to your comment, you're absolutely right, Cameron. Think about this. When we're going to start working with a seller and list a property, there's a very formalized process there, right?
mhm,
They interview agents, they figure out who they want to work with, they work through compensation. And then when they're ready to make that commitment and select their agent, they both enter into a contractual agreement to proceed. It's that same idea now, but just on the buyer side. And again, it's not new. I'm not suggesting this is a new thing. It's what has always been available, but it's
mhm.
not an often used approach by buyer's agents.
Yeah. Why do you think that the majority? Well, because you mentioned that I feel like a big cause of it not being used that often is because they're not being taught to use it.
I think it's two things. I think it's not only that we weren't necessarily always taught, but that
Hmm.
it didn't always seem necessary because of the norms of how buyers
Mm,
brokers were paid, right?
hmm.
And that is, again, traditionally a seller and their listing agent determine the total compensation that they're willing to pay that listing brokerage to market and sell their home, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then within that total compensation agreed to, what portion, if any, is going to be shared to a buyer's brokerage that brings the buyer? And
Mm-hmm.
again, that process still reigns supreme when it comes to how to market a listing,
Mm-hmm.
because you are incentivizing the real estate community to all rally behind that home and get that home sold because you're offering a compensation model. It makes all the sense in the world.
Mm-hmm.
For that reason, a lot of buyers agents never felt it very necessary to establish and formalize how they're going to get paid, because how they were
Mm-hmm.
going to get paid just based on the norms of real estate was already predetermined on the other side of the equation. Okay. That doesn't mean that
Mm-hmm.
it was like, when I say predetermined, I mean each individual seller and their broker decided beforehand. That doesn't mean there
Mm-hmm.
was like this common blanket, this is what everyone gets paid. That's not how things went down ever. I think most sellers are abundantly clear just how negotiable compensation is. How do I know that that's true? Because there's always been discount brokerages out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's always
Mm-hmm.
been companies like the help you sells, or, do it for a flat fee, or the a la carte. So I don't subscribe to this idea that sellers have been, bamboozled on any level.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that I think over the course of time, people, consumers, have forgotten that those things were always an option for them.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I also struggle with that idea because again, there's discount brokerages out there that a lot of sellers will flock to, and
Yeah.
or for sale by owners. So I yeah, we'll
Yeah.
leave it there. But that's why people didn't on the buy side find this really massive need to establish the buyer broker compensation as well as that formalized agreement.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the advantages of really understanding and also applying this buyer broker agreement in your, I would say, like the process of a real estate agent's business?
Yeah, so it really is going to come down to, again, understanding it and your skill sets. But if you navigate that contract correctly, what you're
Mm-hmm.
basically doing is establishing to a buyer your approach, your value proposition, your leadership style, and you're essentially having a buyer either determine that they are committed to working with you because of the value that you bring,
Mm-hmm.
or that they're not going to work with you either at all, or they're not going to work with you in an exclusive manner,
Mm-hmm.
which is good to know as an agent, right? I think
Yeah.
right now a lot of agents are out there operating as if they have a committed client and they don't. This contract formalizes it. So the buyer
Mm-hmm.
has to make a decision and then is going to put pen to paper to let you know what that decision is. So if they're going to
Yeah.
be loyal to you, if they're going to be exclusive to you, they're signing their name to that. And if they're
Yeah.
not going to be loyal and exclusive to you, they're signing their name to that if they're going to work with you at all. I think it's a really big benefit. There's always been agents out there operating as if they were
Mm-hmm.
working with a client exclusively and were unaware that the client had a different idea in mind and was working with other agents the entire time.
Mm-hmm. Is there any benefit to the like why would an agent sign a or why would a buyer sign a non-exclusive BRCA?
Okay, so the reason why is because perhaps they don't have a ton of confidence in that particular agent. Um, they
Mm-hmm.
want that option to, maybe work with different agents in different cities. Perhaps I'm not super clear.
Mm-hmm.
My concern for
Mm-hmm.
buyers who take that approach, a lot of people think that they're really super smart in terms of how they approach things, but when you tell someone up front in a professional manner, I'm not going to be loyal to you, I'm not going to be exclusive to you, I don't know what kind of expectation you have in terms of effort, willingness, engagement, communication, effort, the whole nine that you're going to get from someone when you full on tell them, I'm going to go work with other people as well as you. I mean, think about this, Cameron. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I know this is not like a direct correlation, but it would be like dating. Like, hey, person that I'm interested in, yeah, I'm interested in you, but I'm also interested in a lot of other people. And I'm going to sign my name here that basically lets you know in advance, like, there is no exclusion here, right? Like, we are not exclusive. So that's how
Yeah.
we're approaching this thing. But yet you want that
Mm-hmm.
other party to have full engagement, full willingness, and pour all of their resources in, I just don't think that that establishes a very good dynamic for a buyer who approaches things that
Hmm.
way.
Yeah. And like you said, like it acts as a qualifier. If I was an agent, I would want to present that before actually going out and starting to do all the work for the buyer, because it shows me how serious they are in actually buying. Like
Yeah, and
is it safe to agree that like if a buyer was like, yeah, let's do it, it shows somebody that they're later in the, I want to say like the buying stages, and they're far enough in that buying stage and they're ready to actually start actively looking. So that contract acts as a like buyer qualifier in a way.
yeah, it's interesting because in California, our buyer representation and broker compensation agreement
Hmm.
actually establishes now when a buyer is to be disclosed to the potential compensation for a property. So to establish that agreement before even showing homes is important now because you may be missing a step based on what that contract lays out in terms of the process that you and the buyer agree
Mm-hmm.
upon. Yes. And then this is where things get really interesting, Cameron. Okay, think about this. In that document, again, this is for California. It basically asks, all right, between the buyer and the broker, their agent, I
Hmm.
need to tell you as my buyer, I'm the brokerage, right? Or I'm the broker, the agent. I need to disclose to you on properties what I might be compensated, meaning what is being offered from a listing agent. So,
Hmm.
buyer, you now have an option. Would you like me to disclose that information for to you before showing you a house, or disclose it before writing an offer for you?
Hmm.
Now, think about this. Think about how this empowers a buyer. Okay. Let's say
Hmm.
that we did a buyer broker agreement and the compensation that we agreed to was 2.5%. Okay.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
demonstrated my value. I showed you the resources, the time, the energy that I'm going to put into helping you acquire a home. And you said, based on your leadership, the approach, I have a lot of confidence. I'm willing to agree to that 2.5% total compensation for the sale price of whatever home I acquire. Great. We've
Hmm.
established that part of it. Now, if a buyer is like, hey, I want to know before we look at a house what your compensation may be, no problem. It identifies a process to do so. But if a buyer sees like, hey, there was this home on Main Street, okay, great. And there was two others, what are you potentially going to get compensated? Because I want to know before we see them.
Hmm.
Well, the one on Main Street, let's say it only offers 1.5%. And then the buyer can do simple math. Well, if they're only agreeing up front to pay 1.5% to what I owe you, agent, that means I owe you another 1%. How are we going to bridge that gap? Do I
Hmm.
even want to see that home anymore? And whose decision is that? It's the buyer's decision.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It's
100%.
really interesting how the consumers, right, buyers and sellers, they want all the transparency in the world. Sellers, be careful what you ask for now because you may not understand that now buyers are going to be empowered through this representation agreement. They need transparency too. They
Hmm.
know what you and your agent now are willing to offer their buyer's agent to represent
Hmm.
them. And if for any reason they determine that that's not enough, that's a buyer's decision. They're going to have that information.
Yep. That's going to be interesting. What do you think would happen if that was the case, to where you negotiated, you did a buyer's consultation,
Yep.
had them sign that BRCA. In the BRCA, it states how much that the buyer wants to pay the buyer's agent.
Yes, they have to agree to it there.
Okay. So say it was
2.5%.
hypothetically,
Just
yeah,
that
two and a
for
half percent.
yeah.
Yeah. And then the buyer fell in love with a home where they're only offering 1.5%. Like,
Yep.
what happens there? Like, and
Well,
they're
then,
like, we love this home, we want to make an offer, but that, like, what happens?
yeah, great question. So in the contract, the buyer broker agreement, right?
Hmm.
The BRBC, in that contract, it even asks, do you, buyer, authorize me to request more compensation from a seller if the listing brokerage compensation does not cover your total cost? Meaning, if we agree that I'm going to get paid 2.5%, but that particular listing, the listing brokerage is only covering 1.5%, and we got a 1% gap. Do
Mm-hmm.
you authorize me to ask for the seller in your offer when we write an offer? Do you authorize me to request to make up that difference?
Mm-hmm.
And you're doing that in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So if the buyer says, well, of course, because I want them to pay, I don't want to have to come out of pocket. Well, great. I guess the simplest way to answer your question, Cameron, is this. What's happening, the reason why real estate has worked so well for buyers and sellers for this long period of time is because agent compensation was not a part of a purchase agreement between buyer and seller.
Mm-hmm.
Buyers and sellers didn't have to worry about an agent compensation getting into the mix of them working out a deal and buying and selling a house. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now if the buyer decides that they do want their agent to have that authority to go and ask for the compensation, now agent compensation may be a party to most real estate transactions moving forward. People are already having a hard time negotiating price and terms and appraisal contingencies, and you name it. Requests for
Mm-hmm.
repairs. Are you going to leave the appliances? Add to that mix if an agent's going to get paid something.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Dang. Yeah. Because then the first thing, man, and it's interesting because it can come from. I'm just like logically thinking about this, and correct me if I'm wrong. The three places, if the buyer was like, no, I want this home. I really want this home.
Mhm.
Yet that was the scenario where the agent wasn't getting paid that gap of 1%. If you think about it, it's like, okay, like you guys come to the negotiation table and it's like, hey, we have an issue. They love the home, all this good stuff, but we signed an agreement. Well, this is the situation. And then now it's like, okay, that money's going to come from one of three places. One, your buyer, which I think would be the last resort as, representing my buyer. Two, the seller's net, whatever they're netting, you got to take an extra 1% out of that to pay me. Or three, which the listing agent isn't going to like this, you're going to have to share now 1% of
Renegotiating.
your commission with
Yes.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact,
Oh, no.
an agent just the other day said something that I thought was absolutely brilliant. Okay. And if she's watching this, thank you. And I told you I was going to steal it. I told her. Okay. So, in all transparency, here it is.
Mhm.
He said, the way I explain it to my buyer is this: buyer, just understand you're third in line to pay, not first. You're third in line to pay.
Mhm.
Who's number one? Number one is what's been predetermined in the multiple listing service between the seller and their listing brokerage of how much the listing brokerage is going to pay the buyer's brokerage. That's the
Mhm.
first person in line to pay. That doesn't bridge the gap. The second person in line to pay, assuming the buyer gives authority for the agent to do so, is that buyer's agent asking the seller directly to compensate the buyer's brokerage. Okay, so they're the second in line. And then if those two
Mhm.
parties, for whatever reason, still aren't able to bridge that gap, then the third person in line is the actual buyer who had the agent represent them.
Mhm.
Yep. And
Yeah.
so again, I'm not saying this is wrong or bad. What I am
Mhm.
suggesting though is that what is already an extremely complex dynamic of buying and selling real estate. I don't care how many iBuyers there are out there. I don't care what websites come out into the world.
Mhm.
Buying and selling the biggest investment in most people's financial portfolio in their life has complexity to it.
Yep.
Full stop, period, end of story. This only
Mhm.
complicates it more. So, what does that mean? That means buyers, sellers, hey, you want full transparency in the whole night? No problem. We can do that. But understand what you're asking for just adds in a lot more layers of complexity. That's okay.
Mhm.
That's all right. But I
Yep.
would also recommend be very cognizant of who you're working with because that's
Mhm.
always been true. this is a multiplier of how true that is moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I would argue that this, I would say on a mic, well, yeah, I would say that this is going to increase the professionalism bar of real estate agents just because one, to buyers, now they're going to be it's kind of like I'm going to have to prove my 2.5%, 3% to the buyer now. If I'm going to ask them for that, now I'm going to have to,
Yes.
give them something that is equated to that 2.5%, whatever they're paying me.
And Cameron, I
And
would
then
argue
two,
that there are a
yeah, go
lot
ahead.
of buyer's agents out there that have always delivered on that level. They
Hmm.
just maybe didn't know that they had to communicate it as well,
Hmm.
present it in a way that made it fully understandable to a buyer. It was just like,
Hmm.
hey, trust me, I'm amazing and I'm going to make your buying experience dramatically different than not working with me. That's not going to cut it anymore. Not to say that their
Hmm.
actual performance needs to go up. For a lot of them, it will, but not
Hmm.
everyone. It's not that everyone's performance needs to go up, but your ability to communicate that performance and
Hmm.
essentially help someone understand why it's of value,
Hmm.
that skill set's going to go through the roof.
Yeah. Because then I was going to say the second thing, which is this may impact the performance of the real estate community as a whole, is like everybody's going to have to sharpen up their negotiation skills now.
Yes,
And it's like
absolutely.
with these, all these different factors moving around in a deal now, you're going to have to really, know what you're doing. And then this is going to then impact, how, I think, in my opinion, like how many clients you then can attract to yourself,
And
just
let me
because
break
now
something to
buyers,
you. Let me break something
uh,
to you, Cameron, and to any other agents that are watching out there and to buyers and sellers if you happen to come across this video. I don't care what someone's Instagram looks like. I don't care what kind of clothes they're wearing. I don't care what kind of car they drive. I don't care what kind of closing, dialogue they have. That's not great negotiation when
yep,
it comes to actual performance in buying and selling real estate. The
yep,
real masters of negotiation do it through the contract because that's the only legal and binding document transferring
mm,
title from one person to another. So
mm-hmm,
I don't care how slick your closing statements are. I really don't. If you don't know that contract inside and out, how to navigate it and how to perform accordingly and communicate that to your clients so they understand it and know how to make proper decisions,
mm-hmm,
you can kid yourself all you want with your fancy car. You're not going to do a stellar job for your client unless you know that contract and how to operate it. That's where
yeah,
the negotiation skills are going to go through the roof for a select few, while
mm-hmm.
the others kid themselves with all the other stuff that actually just truly doesn't matter.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's very true.
Mhm.
So speaking of communicating that, how would you introduce this contract to a new buyer? New buyer calls you looking for properties. How would you introduce this to them?
Yeah, actually, the good news is like my approach to buyers anyway, like my process already lends itself perfectly to signing a buyer broker agreement. Okay. And
Mm, mm,
and to answer your question in my process is really simple. Usually it's going to start with like an in-person engagement, call it at an open house, for example, or a phone conversation, right? Buyer calls me
mm,
from a sign or someone that I know, and they express their interest in purchasing a home. My process is to immediately have what's called a buyer's consultation with
mm,
that prospective client. And in that buyer's consultation, essentially what I'm doing is creating the framework of what it looks like to buy a home. So it's very
mm,
educational. I integrate a lot as far as what the expectations are, as well as what the market looks like right now from a buyer's perspective so they can understand how to navigate within that market. So they understand
mm,
reality. This is all
mm,
very data driven. From there, I really go into exactly what my process is, how I perform as an agent when someone's going to buy a home, and what really differentiates my processes versus anyone else's process.
mm,
And at that point, it's really easy. The buyer has a clear expectation in general what it looks like to do what they're asking to do, which is buy a home.
mm,
I've demonstrated my ability by educating them on a market and giving them very data driven realities, and then applied over that how to navigate within those truths. And then finally, clearly communicated to them what I do, how I do it, and why I do it differently than others. And then it's a really easy decision for them. Do they subscribe to my leadership or do they not? If they do,
Mm,
then that's when we're going to start going into that buyer's broker agreement. And even more so, I can demonstrate to them my level of knowledge and understanding because
mm,
they're going to see not only are we establishing a formalized agreement, we're establishing a formalized relationship, but then I'm going to show them how we're actually going to navigate that process according to that agreement.
mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
that's the way, in my opinion, how to do it. Immediately have an engagement with this buyer client, establish really good understandings of what's happening in the market, expectations. And then, of course, going through that buyer broker agreement is all a party to those things because it really lays the framework of how are you going to go and show properties? How are you going to communicate to them what you're going to potentially be paid? And of course,
Mm-hmm.
what they're going to agree that you should be compensated for your work.
Yeah.
That will really tee you up for a really upfront, heavy homework kind of approach to a buyer. That means
Mm-hmm.
that once that homework is done, you can go out there and now really perform with a lot of the expectations already set.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like a huge part of presenting this is actually having a process in play too, that you actually take the buyer through.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some really key things about how to actually navigate this contract that could put an agent in hot water versus not put them in hot water. And what do I mean by that? A lot of these changes to our industry and how we're engaging consumers, right? And having almost like this abundance of clarity and conversation around all things compensation.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know the proper steps of even filling this thing out, you could literally position yourself where someone could point to you and say, this is proof that this person didn't give me the ability to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh.
So everything that we're trying to create clarity that we're not doing, if you don't operate in this document correctly, you could be pointed to like, no, see, this is proof that this person doesn't allow for negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
So people better
Yeah.
know what they're doing.
Yeah, 100%. Have you been in or what are your thoughts on this situation to where, because you mentioned like you meet the buyer at an open house,
Mhm.
and I'm assuming if it's not a busy open house, then you can have this like buyer consultation there, or are you doing it there or
No,
at the open
traditionally I'm not.
house? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
traditionally, I'm not. Traditionally,
Yeah.
at an open house, because a buyer consultation, at least the way that I present it, especially if we're going to get into the BRBC, and I always want to formalize that contract as quickly as we can, right? I want to make sure I
Mm-hmm.
demonstrate what we're doing, set clear expectations, and then start moving forward.
Mm.
Um, that's a process that at minimum is going to take about 45 minutes. So
Yeah.
I would like to think that my open houses won't allow me for 45 minutes with one person.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. So, question. So, what happens when you may get a buyer lead from online anywhere, and maybe you're like a real estate agent or your brokerage is running ads of,
Mhm.
hey, here's some homes in our area, and get set up on um, um, not the what's your home worth, but the other one to where it's sending them properties.
Sure.
So, and you got a new buyer lead that's like, hey, I want to go check out this property. Like, what do you do in that situation to where you're like, wait a second, like we have to sit down and have this buyer consultation first, but they want to go and see this property. Like I can imagine an agent is
Yeah.
like, I don't want to lose out on this by, being like, wait a second, let's, let's sign this document first and then we can go see it. Like, what do you do in that situation?
It's a great question. I think that there's always room for being fluid. Okay. And sometimes you have to engage someone the way that they're willing to be engaged, right? They don't know that they want a formalized agreement with you until they've met you. For consumers, it's going to be new too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as they know, like, I just wanted to go see this house and now you want to do a meeting and the whole nine. So, I think that in a lot of ways, we need to be fluid and we need to engage people in which is going to be, um, you know, a, a conduit to a relationship. So, in some cases, yeah, you might have to go show a property. But as
Yeah.
soon as you can, you want to have that formalized meeting. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've seen this done in a few ways. That initial call, a lot of times what I will do is I will tell them after going through the property information, right? I'll share with you a really good one. A
Mm-hmm.
coach that I work with, James Cottrell, guy's stellar. I don't take credit for this. This is something he taught me. When you get a call from a client, a new buyer, let's say a new lead, right? And this should help agents to just be willing to pick up their phone. It's one of the most important things that you can do as an agent. Answer the phone. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a way to do it where you don't feel like you have to be worried about what's going to come at you on the other side of that call in a good way. Like a buyer saying, "Hey, I'm really interested in this house. I want to see it. I have some questions about it." Buyers might be in front of other buyers and they're worried to pick up that call because what if that happens? No, what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm about to share with you could solve all those problems. What James taught me, I thought it was a brilliant idea, is if you get a call like that, take it, right? Answer that phone. If you're in front of other people, hey, even if you're working on a property valuation for a listing, take that call. And what you could simply say is, great. So you're calling me about 123 Main Street. Hey, listen, that's awesome. I'm actually not in a position where I can pull up the data on that home for you in this moment, but I will be in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, whatever. Okay. So you're establishing that you're not going to be able to answer their questions in this moment. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what you can simply do is just let them know, like, hey, I'm going to get back to you though. But I always answer my calls. That consumers like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can say that you're going to do something, follow through and do it, they like that too. So we're starting to really build rapport, gain
Mm-hmm.
some trust. But here's the trick. Okay, great. So I'm going to have to call you back. Hey, before I hang up with you though, 123 Main Street. That's awesome. What about that home is it that you like? Is it the area, square footage, number of bedrooms? You're collecting information.
Mm-hmm.
What does this do for you? It allows you to always be in a position to answer your phone and not feel the obligation. You have to drop everything or ignore your clients. Like you can handle a lot of things if you know how to navigate it. Okay. So that's the one
Mm-hmm.
thing it does. The second thing it allows you to do is before you call them back, not only can you go and get all the information you need on that property. So whatever question they have, you're in a position to answer them in a professional way. It
Mm-hmm.
also gives you the space to look up other properties based on what they
Mm-hmm.
are looking for that could position you to have them see other ones with you as well. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All that is to say, if you do that, now you're in a position to say, listen, I know you want to see that one, but here are some others. Why don't we set up time to go see a few at once? Okay. And by the
Mm-hmm.
way, if we're going to do that, I really love to set up my clients for success. And one of the best ways to do that is for us
Mm-hmm.
to spend about 45 minutes together so I can show you things about the market, really set good expectations, and then dive really deep down into what you're looking for in a home.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We can just spend some time to understand your wants and needs. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the buyer consultation.
Mm-hmm.
So, why don't we meet at Starbucks at 9 a.m. before we start looking at homes at 10? Does that work?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Done deal. You set up you've already nailed it. You are doing your process.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, you can kind of do both. Be fluid and willing to go and meet people, but still fit in what your process is in the interim.
Right. Right.
Now, if they're calling you because they're standing out front of a house and you can go over there and do it, again, be fluid. I would probably go and do that. And then when
Mm-hmm.
we've had a chance to look at that home, I'd say, listen, it's extremely important in this market climate that I set my clients up for success. Okay. That's me also doing an assumption close because I'm assuming you're my client. Remember, those are those little
Mm-hmm.
things that we do, right?
Yeah.
So, but I'm telling them this is why my clients win, right? So they're like, "Ooh, I want to be one of those people who wins." Great.
Yep.
Here's what we do. Spending 45 minutes to really dive into your needs and wants and really helping you understand how to navigate this market so that you win makes all the difference in the world. Can we meet on Zoom this afternoon? Can we meet on Zoom tomorrow morning? Can I meet you at Starbucks, after this showing?
Mm-hmm.
Set that appointment.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah, I love how it's also you're giving them the option of like, hey, I understand if you're busy because I know a majority of I think it's according to the NER, a majority of home buyers are married couples with kids,
Hmm.
and so like obviously they're out doing stuff and while they're looking at property, so they're busy people. And so you're giving them the option of like, hey, we could sit down at a Starbucks, grab something to eat, go to a restaurant, whatever it is, or, we can jump on a Zoom and,
Absolutely.
we could just do it online. Yeah.
I mean,
And,
I don't know if it's COVID or what, but I'm finding people really find a lot of value in the Zoom option. And
mm-hmm,
for me, obviously, it's more efficient with my time. I love that. We
mm-hmm,
have to be really good at making sure that our personality comes through the screen. So be cognizant of that. But then
mm-hmm,
finally, recognize when you're in a Starbucks or if you're at their kitchen table, like a lot of us who use a visual will probably have a laptop or a tablet, which is great. But you know how much easier it is to hit share screen on Zoom so that everyone can see it. Plus, I can record it. That
mm,
has been super helpful because for a lot of them, like, great, I recorded this for us so I could send you a recording of our meeting. And a lot of
mm-hmm.
people really appreciate that.
Yeah, 100%. And I also love how it's like a great qualifier too, because and I believe we talked about this earlier, but how when you ask for that, I want to say like when you ask for that appointment with them,
Mhm.
like if they're like kind of like put off, or it's like, we're just looking around. It's kind of it gives you the opportunity to, it gives you the opportunity to discover if they're a person that is worth, spending time with or not. And so, and obviously with, real estate agents, you want to spend the time with individuals who are serious about actually taking that next step and buying a home. And it gives you the opportunity to ask them like, or well, let me ask you this. If I don't mean to put you on the spot, but like, say you buyer was like, hey, we just passed this home and it's called, we want to go see it. And so you went to go meet them and you were in the home and say they said no. They were like, no, we're just looking around and we don't really want to do
Yeah,
a whatever you want to call it, like buyer consult.
sure.
And so what would be your response to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that I try to really uncover is to incentivize seriousness,
Mm,
right? Like for my clients who want to win, who actually want to get into a home, who want to get the best price and terms, who want to understand how to navigate that contract or the market to their benefit, right? I'm really trying to engage with people who are serious about those things. But if
mhm,
someone isn't serious, it could be a couple of things. Number one, I personally am not trying to close people that just don't find value in me. They don't
mhm,
align with my personality or they've decided like, this is not the person that I want to work with. I'm not trying to close them to want to work with me. I've
mhm,
found that in my life and in my career, I've been far more effective with people who already know a little bit about me and appreciate those things because then they're only going to
mhm,
love working with me that much more versus really
mhm,
trying to force a relationship when people tried to tell me up front that they just, we don't align,
mhm,
value system, personality, whatever it is, and we force those things, that's where things can go sideways. So I'm not trying to close in that way. But I will say that if someone just it isn't their right timeline, well, how do you engage in their process then? Because it may not be any of the things I just described where we're not aligning with values or personality. They're just legitimately not in the place to move forward, right?
mhm,
This could have
mhm,
been one of the very early steps in their decision making or buying process. No problem. I always look for ways how do I infuse myself into their process moving forward? And
mm,
do it in a way that's adding value to them.
mhm,
So great. We're not doing a buyer consultation because you're not in that position yet. Well, let me look for ways in which they are starting to lean into the idea of buying a home. Do they
mm,
know anything about this market? Do they know about other properties coming up? Do they have any idea about new builds or price reductions? I'm looking for opportunities to go, oh, I can solve that problem for you. And now we're going to do this thing together.
mm. Yeah. And what's crazy, Joseph? I feel like that's where if you had this is just like an idea, but you know how John has that buyer
Yes. That
video
series of
series?
videos. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. If you really understood the buyer's journey to a point to where you can create content addressing some of the challenges that's maybe in the way of them actually getting serious,
Sure.
and then being like, "Hey, what's your number? I'll send you this video, like after you figure out that that's the problem. I'll send you this video and you can connect with me online or whatever it is. But this addresses that challenge that you said you're having. And so like I'll go ahead and send it over to you. What's your number? And so
Absolutely.
yeah, now
And
you
think
have
about
a
that, Cameron. What we're doing there is we are again meeting them where they're at right now. And right
mhm,
now they're saying, I want to be arm's length away from you. Fine. And if I could still add value to you that way and show you with a level of confidence that I've got no problem with that because I know that my content and my marketing approach is going to draw you into my funnel,
mhm.
I mean, they're just going to be that much more impressed.
Yeah.
Like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that person was awesome. You know, they didn't try and finagle anything or hard press us, any of those things, but yet
Mhm.
they almost had a swagger to them about how they were still going to add value. And
Yep.
man, now I'm looking at their content like, oh, this is our guy. This is
Yeah.
our gal right here. Like, this is someone that we want to work with. We just didn't know it because we met that person one time for 5 minutes. That's
Hmm.
fair. That's fair. But for
Yeah.
agents, challenge yourselves. How do you engage people where you can add value to them and allow them to organically be attracted to you?
Hmm.
If you can
Yeah.
implement processes in your engagement with buyers and sellers and do that at a high level, oh, you're going to be highly successful.
Yeah. Love that. Yeah. Um, I just had a quick question about the BRCA. Like, how long does it last? Like, you sign that with a buyer. Like, how
Yeah,
long? Yeah.
that's funny. Okay, so one of the things that I teach people because I'm obviously teaching agents how to leverage this buyer broker agreement, right? So in the BRBC, what it does is it establishes a start date and an end date. Any formal contract, at least in California, really needs a start and end date. If it's ambiguous or doesn't have an end date or a start date, it's really hard to enforce that contract. It might even be a nullified contract. So
Mm,
it's unenforceable. The challenge, though, Cameron, is that that contract needs to be reasonable in terms of its time frame.
mm,
So, agents, you're working with a buyer. How long can that take? I know as agents, we would love to lock people down and go, "Oh, you're my buyer. So we're starting today and we're going to be under contract until you're 98 years old. So the next 40 years sound good? Like we can't do that, right? That's not reasonable.
mhm,
So unfortunately, we can't always be as ambiguous as we would like because the ambiguity or that really long duration or that really generalized contract feels really solid for us, right? Well, I've got them under contract for 40 years, no problem. But again, the more ambiguous or the more generalized it becomes, now it becomes potentially unenforceable.
mhm.
So I find that if you're working with a buyer, it's not unreasonable for you to have them under contract for 6 months, 9 months, potentially up to a year. Some of those dynamics might be a little different based on the buyer and what their
Mhm.
situation is. But again, you and the buyer have to agree and formalize that contract.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say if they I'm assuming like just for like experienced agents, they can dive into their, oh, if they're properly using their CRM, they could dive into their CRM and just see like, oh, this lead came in at this date. And then here's when we actually open escrow. So it's taken about, I'm averaging out this amount of time. And then you could maybe add a month to it, I guess, for like as a cushion.
Mhm.
And so, yeah. And then this is interesting because then the goal would be how do we, if for everything that's in our control, how do we shorten this? How do we
Oh, yes.
take,
Yeah,
yeah, 8 months searching for property and turn it into 6 months
sure.
or 4 months? Yeah. 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 That's the exciting part.
Well, again, if that's the client's goal.
100%.
Yeah.
And here's some, yeah, here's something. Yes, 100%. I was gonna go off on a tangent, but I forget like this is your yeah.
Again, it really establishes responsibilities to both parties.
Mm,
What's really cool about it is it actually establishes responsibilities for the buyers. The buyers have now commitments of things that they're going to do and move forward as far
mm,
as like their active participation in their ability to buy. So there's some
mm,
really great things that have to do with that contract. Again, that's specific to California. Um, But agents have to be clear that they are also agreeing to a new process with new
Hmm.
forms and new disclosure and when to disclose and how to disclose. And did you get authorization to ask for additional compensation directly from a seller or not? If you're not clear about this contract and how to navigate that process, be very cautious, because I know we all want to put everyone under contract, but those are mutual agreements, meaning there's usually responsibilities on both sides. And if you're not clear, just getting a bunch of people to sign off on that and then you're not
Yep.
performing accordingly, you could be hurting yourself. So
Yep.
you really need to understand that document, the process in which it deploys as far as working with a buyer, and how to
Hmm.
properly and successfully navigate that contract and that
Yeah.
approach. Mhm.
All I see is like pluses to that. And so
Mhm.
it's like you're being able to better qualify buyers that are coming in. You are you're like solidifying relationships with them. You don't know like, oh, are they working with another agent or not? And so like there's so many bonuses to having that contract in play. Even when making offers on homes, like now there's like I know I'm getting paid this amount. And if not, then I need to better my negotiation skills for when we do go into a home and they're not offering that commission that we signed on the BRCA. And so I see like nothing but pluses with really understanding that contract and then, like you said, like deploying it in the field when you're out working.
Yeah, it spells out a way more robust process as far as working with a buyer. There's more to dos.
Hmm.
There is more disclosure. There is just a lot more in terms of navigating in a professional manner. But getting into that process sooner only is going to elevate the agent, like you talked about. And I really think that it's going to really separate,
Hmm.
um, the agents who really take their profession seriously. I think it's
Hmm.
going to be much clearer, even to the consumer, who's a really serious professional and a really serious practitioner.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yep, 100%. I know that you had a class on the BRCA and teaching it the importance of it, value of it, knowing how to use it and stuff like that. Are you having any more of those classes like coming up?
Yes, none scheduled at this point. I'm likely going to start actually doing them like on Zoom,
Hmm.
for agents to connect, even, have a broader reach for them. Obviously, what I'm teaching is specific to California,
Oh,
but
that's true.
the California is big, so I want to make sure I give people enough opportunity to come and engage and learn.
Mhm.
And I will likely do some more live events as well. But I will even say this: this is like the level in which we need to understand these things. I know that we are likely going to see another revamp of this document and potentially this process as early as March this year.
Mm.
So a lot of people will hear that and go, okay, well, I'll just wait then. No, don't do that. Understand it now. Because if you understand and start to implement that process now, and then those tweaks come, it's just going to be small pivots for you to understand how to dial it in based on any of the changes made. So
Mhm.
I would say learn now and implement now. And then if
Yeah.
you're on that level where you're clear as far as like not only what the processes are, but when those processes might change, that's the kind of practitioner I want all agents to start to level up and become.